Those of us who have dedicated a life's work to the legal profession understand all too well that there are truly two different justice systems at work in the United States. There's the corporation justice system for the wealthy. The CEOs have access to a system that really favors them in every way. Ridiculously small fines for their decisions they make that leave consumers and employees crippled or dead. And then there's the other justice system that low-income Americans live with, where even the smallest legal infraction can land them in prison for years. One of the talking points that you hear coming from right-wing news is that the reason these two separate justice systems exist is because the low-income people simply commit more crimes, and they point to incarceration statistics to back up that claim. But sometimes, in the very rare cases, statistics can lie, and that's exactly what's happening with our criminal justice system. In recent years, the number of convicted criminals that were later exonerated for their alleged crimes has skyrocketed. For example, nearly 10 years ago, just a few dozen people were exonerated after serving time in prison, but in the last 3 to 4 years, more than 100 people each year were exonerated after being convicted for crimes that it turns out they never committed. One thing that most of these wrongfully convicted people all seem to have in common is that they're typically low-income Americans who lack the means to fund a drawn-out legal battle to fight the trumped-up charges against them. Prosecutors use this knowledge to offer plea deals to these defendants, resulting in false confessions and convictions. But as science has evolved, groups like the Innocence Project have been working to use available evidence and DNA samples to help exonerate these wrongfully convicted individuals, some of whom have already spent decades in prison for crimes that somebody else committed. Joining me now to discuss this is Mark Godsey, Executive Director of the Ohio Innocence Project and author of the new book, Blind Justice. Mark, can you start out by telling us how bad is the problem of wrongful convictions in the country today, and does it seem to be getting worse?
Yeah, I mean, it's since 1989, there have been now more than 2,000 people who were wrongfully convicted and proven innocent and released. And as you noted a moment ago, the number keeps going up every year. So the last few years, there's been more than 150 people exonerated each year. The system is very, very slow to change. I mean, despite the fact that you turn on the news any given week and you see on average 3 people who are exonerated and walking out sometimes after 40 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, we get a lot of resistance and pushback from the system. So it doesn't seem to be getting much better.
Yeah, Mark, your new book, Blind Injustice, you talk about the role that prosecutors play in these wrongful convictions. How does that occur? Why would a prosecutor take it on themselves to say, I know I'm going to convict somebody that I don't have really good evidence against? How does that happen? What's the culture that allows that to happen?
Well, I talk about that in the book because I used to be a prosecutor, and so I'm one of the few people who are now an innocence lawyer who served for many years as a prosecutor. So that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to give that background to it. But, I mean, you know, it becomes a very competitive environment where you're in a prosecutor's office and everybody's sort of judged on their win-loss record, and everybody wants to move up, everybody's ambitious, everybody wants to do good, just like in any job. And so, you know, it becomes like a game about winning. And you know, especially if it's a case where people think you aren't going to win because maybe the evidence of innocence is strong. If you can win that one, then, you know, you've like pulled a rabbit out of a hat. And, so it's even more, you know, credentials for you that you're able to win this long shot case as a prosecutor. So the tougher the case is from the prosecutor's perspective, the more it is, the better it is for them to win it. So it just becomes this very competitive sort of win at all costs game. The longer you in it, it becomes very self-serving, and, you know, ambition plays into it, and everybody wanting to like just get promoted. And so I lived that very much in my years as a prosecutor.
Mark, I was a prosecutor too, and it varies culture to culture. But I prosecuted in a culture, in an environment where there was zero tolerance for prosecutors who overreached. As a matter of fact, one of the years I was prosecuting, a prosecutor was actually prosecuted themselves by building a case with evidence that should have never been there, by not doing their job and actually making something look far more criminal than it
Wow,
actually
that's great.
was. Don't you think we have to do that? Don't you think we have to police ourselves, and we have to say that, you know, I don't care whether you want to run for governor or attorney general someday, or I don't care if you're prosecuting and you're looking for that special job where you know, a big firm's going to hire me because I did such a good job as a prosecutor. Don't you think we have to affirmatively be involved in going after those people who choose to be a prosecutor, where real justice can be done? But we need to go after those people who choose to do just the opposite. What's your take on that, Mark?
Yeah, I agree. Well, first of all, I agree with you that it's a matter of culture. And so offices have cultures, and, you know, there's prosecutors' offices in Ohio where I run the Ohio Innocence Project that have a great culture, and they work with us, and they, you know, you can tell they want to do the right thing. I can mention the Cleveland one and the one in Columbus as examples, and the culture really is established by the leader, the head prosecutor. So a leader and somebody coming in and intentionally trying to set a culture of justice rather than just wins and losses can make a big difference. And you're right. I mean, one of the problems of these sort of rogue prosecutors or rogue police officers when they go out and they do something they shouldn't do is that there's hardly ever consequences. And, you know, we've got individuals like, for example, in Illinois, some police officers who were caught, you know, basically torturing people during interrogations to get false confessions, and nothing happens to them. I've got my own cases in Ohio where we got exonerations and the court found police misconduct and nothing happened to the police officers. They kept their jobs. And so it's very rare that anything happens. And part of the problem is the U.S. Supreme Court has extended qualified immunity to the point where it's very hard to sue anybody. So there's no financial ramifications for misconduct. So it needs to be cultural and attitudinal change from the leaders on down, setting an example that we're going to, you know, we're in this for the right reasons. And it's not about just wins and losses. It's about justice. And then we need to do a better job of making sure that people who overstep the bounds when they have power are actually punished for it. I agree with you.
Yeah, when you consider the fact that we live in a high-tech world with some pretty amazing scientific advances made in just the last few decades, how is it possible that so many people are being convicted based on, I guess you'd call it junk science very often? I mean, when I was prosecuting, you know, the idea of a hair sample was questioned. Virtually, there was nothing that was pathognomonic of anything where it comes to biologicals. Science has changed, though. We do know enough. If law enforcement does their job, and a prosecutor makes law enforcement do their job, when they say, you've brought me a case that I think is really weak, so you need to do A, B, and C, and maybe I'll go forward with it. That's the role a prosecutor should play. But what's your take on this technology?
Yeah, one of the things that we've learned through the innocence movement and all these people who've been exonerated is that a lot of these so-called forensic sciences that we've been using for decades to convict people are not as scientific as we thought, and are in many cases never been validated, and they're somewhat unreliable. And so the ironic thing is that we got these shows like CSI where they sort of tell the public that these forensic sciences are these miracles that are akin to putting man on the moon. And, you know, we sort of realize now that there's not a scientific basis. They're often extremely unreliable. The conclusions that the CSI experts are testifying to in court are exaggerated and overstated. And so it's not just me saying this. I mean, in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences, which is a prestigious independent agency established by President Lincoln's administration, that's how long it's been around, they came out with a scathing report. It was like 500 pages long, called Strengthening Forensic Sciences, A Path Forward, talking about how all the changes we need to make, because, you know, even like fingerprinting, a lot of times there's problems with it that the public doesn't realize. But a lot of these things like bite mark, you know, there's a teeth marks in the dead body that's found, and they match it up to the defendant. They get a forensic odontologist to look at it and say, oh, this, you know, this bite mark was made by this defendant. All these different kinds of pattern matching and evidence and things like that. It's actually quite subjective and tends to be unreliable. And so we need to go back and have new standards for it and make sure that the experts are operating under those standards. And again, one of the problems is the system is just very slow to make changes. Even though this report came out in 2009, the Obama administration echoed it and said we need to make changes. Very little changes ever happen.
Well, unfortunately, a good attorney, a good trial lawyer can make some of these almost nonsensical biologicals look like it's beyond a reasonable doubt kind of evidence. And that's unfortunate, because sometimes they do that. But isn't the other part of it that you have an industry, what I call the biological forensic industry, that kind of perpetuates themselves. You know, they say, yeah, we've got it down to a science. We can tell you everything you want to know about hair sample, everything you want to know about a tooth sample, whatever it may be.
Absolutely. I mean, I talk about that in chapter 2.
They all have their specialty.
I talk about that in chapter 2 of Blind
Injustice. You see that developing more and more, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah, I see that. I talk about that in chapter 2 of Blind Injustice. It's sort of like a junk science industrial complex. You get these people who have gone around testifying about these, what we now know are unreliable or junk sciences, and they made a fortune off of them. And then all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, hey, this is unreliable. Maybe we shouldn't be convicting people based on this. They fight back with ferocity and really go against, the establishment really fights back. And I give numerous examples of that, like in the bite mark area, the shaken baby syndrome and things like that. That's what a lot of chapter 2 is about. There's a documentary called The Syndrome about how the medical establishment, all the doctors who have gotten rich testifying on the shaken baby syndrome theory, have fought back against discoveries in the medical sciences that the theory they were relying on really wasn't very reliable and resulted in wrongful convictions. And it's pretty alarming. People should check out that documentary. It's
well, we saw this. You saw the same thing happen where they did regression psychology, with psychologists would have women believing that their fathers assaulted them when there was absolutely nothing other than the regression testimony. And then all of a sudden, those cases started emerging until we found out that most of that was completely fraudulent. So, I mean, we're all at the mercy of all this. And I think that's why it's so important that you've written such a great book here, Blind Injustice. Mark, thank you for being out there doing that. Hopefully, you'll be out on the speaking circuit convincing more people that we need to rethink the way that we go about criminal convictions in this country. Thanks for joining me, okay?